January 17, 1945. Docks under winter sky, Newport News, Virginia. Cold air tasting of salt and coal smoke. Hundreds of men, sun-faded field tunics, dust from vanished deserts still in their seams, file up from a Liberty ship's hold, blink under floodlights, and wait as military policemen count. A train waits. Pullman cars with padded seats, steam hissing, glass bright as a theater marquee in the dark. The men lift their noses. There it is again. The warm, yeasty smell they first noticed aboard ship. White bread. Sliced thick, soft, improbably sweet. A guard jokes and breaks a loaf with his thumbs. The crust crackles. Somewhere ahead in the depot, a pot of coffee percolates, the metal lid rattling like a small bell. They expected shackles and hunger. What they get is a seat by the window and a sandwich of ham and the kind of bread they hadn't tasted since before the war. That smell will follow them across a continent, through wire, through months and miles and slow awakenings, until it becomes something more than food. It becomes a question. Why are the Americans feeding us like this? Do they think we are guests? The train pulls, the track sings, and the men stare out into a night of lighted towns and unbombed factories, flaring stars across the sky. The background is this. By 1943, the British were running out of room. Prisoners captured from Tunisia to Normandy strained the capacity of camps in the United Kingdom. The United States agreed, reluctantly at first, to house the overflow. By war's end, roughly 425,000 Germans would live behind American wire, in some 500 to 700 facilities scattered across 46 states, from the red clay of Alabama to the winter wheat of Nebraska to the desert wind of Arizona. The office of the Provost Marshal General ran it. The rules were set by the Geneva Convention of 1929. Equal rations to those of American troops, quarters by rank, pay for enlisted labor, officers exempt from forced work, Red Cross oversight, and, crucially, an insistence, formal and fussy, that even enemies have rights. The camps would look, as one historian noted, more like standard American training posts than dungeons. Barracks, parade grounds, baseball diamonds, canteens that sold tobacco and paper and chocolate for camp scrip, barbed wire and towers to remind you who you were. Schedules and formations to remind you who you had been. What mattered about that first night wasn't comfort, it was contrast. Many who'd come from cracked cold flats in German cities, or from tents through a winter campaign of defeats, discovered that American abundance was not a rumor. The shock began in the holds of the returning Liberty ships, where stewards ladled thick stews into tin bowls. It continued in those Pullman cars, in the depot lunch counters, in the white bread. A former prisoner said he gained 57 pounds in 2 years. Another, captured at 128 pounds, weighed 185 upon repatriation. They complained, at first, about the coffee and the bland, cake-like bread, but ate until they burned the leftovers out of fear the rations might be cut for waste. They weren't. Not then. On Thanksgiving and Christmas, the mess halls were decorated. The officers, by treaty, sometimes sipped wine. It was not paradise. It was something more disorienting. It was ordinary good treatment, scaled for an army. You know the image, barbed wire, watchtowers, lines of laundry and prairie wind. But listen closer and you'll hear other sounds. The clink of canteen mugs, a baseball thwack, the patient hum of a projector on a Wednesday film night, and the click of chessmen sliding across boards made in the camp workshop. The routine was military, reveille, roll call, work details for enlisted men, dinner, classes, lights out. Officers prepared their own formations. Sergeants barked. Discipline reconstituted itself because the rhythm felt like home. In Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, California, and beyond, civilian employers signed government contracts. The government charged 45 cents an hour per man to offset camp costs. The prisoners saw 80 cents a day in script, which bought cigarettes, writing paper, deck of cards time. They harvested sugar beets, stacked hay, picked oranges with quotas measured in boxes, scrubbed equipment, planed boards, shoveled snow, labored in canneries deemed safe. It was not forced service to American arms. The convention prohibited dangerous or directly military labor. It was everything else. The economy's connective tissue, and it mattered in a country where millions were overseas and tomatoes still needed picking. Expectation meets experience. Men who had sailed west braced for cruelty and found instead a picnic on the edge of a field. A farmer's wife handing out sandwiches while wagons rattled, and a farm boy peered at the strangers like they were astronauts. They had been told, some by party lectures, others by rumor, that America was decadent and disordered, a jazz-soaked colossus hollow beneath the noise. Yet the factories pulsed, the trains ran on time, the towns glowed at night, lit in ways that made German eyes sting with the difference. Men judged not by lectures, but by what they saw. And what they saw were workers who lived better than many German officers, wives who drove to town, idle afternoons in a land too large to believe, and a government that fed enemies from a position of ease rather than thin charity. There were limits and obvious wrongs. The wire was real. Letters were censored. Nights were counted off. There were punishments. Bread and water confinement for refusing quotas. Transfer to stricter camps like Alva, Oklahoma, for men who threatened or intimidated fellow prisoners into harder line loyalty. Discipline wasn't gentle, merely bounded. Occasionally, guard violence erupted. The army weeded unstable men out of camp duty where needed. And there was the strange, bitter American contrast that could not be ignored. Black American soldiers, citizens in uniform, reported they were barred from restaurants that admitted German prisoners under guard. Private Rupert Trimmingham wrote of the sting in a national magazine, and scholars later traced how frequently German POWs moved with more freedom through Jim Crow's contradictions than black servicemen could. That wound belongs to the American ledger. The prisoners noticed it too. But in the aggregate, across Aliceville, Alabama, where the camp sprawled over 800 acres and a museum now holds the art they carved, across Nebraska's Fort Robinson where football matches kicked up dust, across Camp Algona, Iowa, where a hand-built nativity scene astonished locals, the weight of experience tilted toward a phrase many used years later: golden cage, not gilded, but safe. Not liberty, but something that made men sleep well. Our treatment was excellent, said one who became a doctor in Maine. They were bored and restless, and then, sometimes, engaged. Classes in English or algebra, woodworking and orchestra, theater in makeshift halls, chess tournaments broadcast on local radio, a newspaper wall-printed in German and heavily argued over, and, in time, the books. In a building some called the schoolhouse, a new kind of battle began. The American Army's Special Projects Division coordinated a re-education program that would later be remembered, judged, misremembered, and revised in memory. It avoided slogans, at least at its best, and offered books. Goethe beside Whitman, histories of Washington and Lincoln, pamphlets on the Bill of Rights, newspapers from neutral states, films, often about small American towns, juries, newspapers, meant less to preach than to show. A teacher might begin with civics and end with baseball, or begin with baseball, the rule book as a kind of pocket constitution, and move to civics. The purpose was not to pry loose identities with a crowbar, but to let the men see the scaffolding of another system. Slow, procedural, plodding, astonishingly well-fed. The phrase denazification would come later. For many, the immediate effect was far simpler. Trust what your eyes show you. A factory making a bomber every hour, a supermarket stacked tall, a camp canteen whose shelves refilled without drama. Elections reported on the radio as if outcomes mattered more than leaders. In the barracks, the arguments lasted past lights out, under blankets, the low hum of German voices measuring what had been promised against what was now in their hands. A deck of cards, a cigarette, a thick slice of white bread. There is a number that deserves its own silence, Only about 2,022 escape attempts out of hundreds of thousands interned, barely a 0.5%. And most of those ended with a sheepish return or a quick capture, hunger-beating ideology. The barriers did their work. The land itself did the rest. Where would you go? Across cornfields that shift their green by the mile, through towns where the language snaps differently. The country's size stunned them all over again. Many who tried were hedgehogs rolling from one ditch to the next. Tales of the famous escape at Papago Park shimmered at the margins of rumor. But these are side notes. The center of the experience was not flight. It was the discipline of routine and the slow infusion of a new normal. Work changed the air. On a Nebraska farm, a teenager remembered the prisoners became friends, playing games with local kids and bringing candy and gum saved from their ration. Small miracles wrapped in cellophane. Farmers contracted for labor and then set tables in the shade. Potato salad, iced tea, pie. Men who a year earlier had fired machine guns over dunes now swung hay bales. Built garages with nailing lines set straight by string and eye. Picked beets until their hands were sugared red-brown. At noon, they ate. This is not to romanticize. The work could be hard and mindless. In some camps, a man who worked too slowly earned himself a stint on bread and water. Unions wrote letters of protest, and the government received stacks of mail each week demanding stricter treatment. News of American casualties hardened some hearts. In the wire's shadow, men argued politics so fiercely that the army sometimes split barracks to separate hardliners from those willing to read more broadly or work more fully. But the day after the argument, the foreman still needed the beets pulled, and the table still had a loaf in its center. The bread sat there, white as a flag. In Aliceville, Alabama, the camp orchestra tuned for Sunday performances. Men carved tiny violins from scrap and coaxed them to sing. In the evenings, the projector whirred, newsreels, comedies, films about New England towns and western horizons. And afterward, men shuffled into cool air and counted stars. In Iowa, the Algona nativity was built with patience and skill that stunned the town, the Holy Family shaped by hands that had loaded mortars in Tunisia. In Kansas, prisoners built a garage so square that it still stands, a small, stubborn testament to the fact that work well done argues for itself. At Fort Robinson, the fields became European in the men's minds when they played football. The echoes of names, Schmidt to Miller, carrying above American prairie grass. In the canteen, the white bread stacks dwindled and renewed. Then, slowly. The transformation, not the sudden conversion of enemy into acolyte, but something more human, the loosening of certainty. Many arrived afraid of the Soviets, or of British reprisals, or of nameless American cruelties. Packed rumors had sailed with them. In the camps, rumor met procedure. The procedure held. If the United States had wanted to break them, it would not have baked. If it had wanted to humiliate them, it would not have taught. The men wrote home, some careful, some exuberant. Letters stacked in censors' rooms. Packages arrived from the Red Cross like little countries wrapped in twine. The image of America they built in their heads. Yes, a myth, but also a record, grew around the object their senses could not ignore: abundance. After years of rationing, after black bread and turnips, after substitutes for everything, they encountered a system whose central fact was that it did not need substitutes. A slice of white bread became more than starch. It became the taste of a society confident enough to feed enemies as if scarcity were a problem that could be solved by effort rather than fear. Hard men softened. A handful hardened more, their resentments calcified by the very fact of humiliation in plenty. And there were those who were simply grateful not to be shot at. "I like it here because no one is shooting at me," one told a milkman in Kansas. It isn't a lofty sentiment. It is an honest one. By the end of 1945, when orders came to repatriate or to route through Britain to labor reparations, Camps wrote their closure on WDAGO forms and mailed them away like final attendance sheets. The trains came again. Men boarded carrying shoeboxes of mementos, a carved chess knight, a booklet on constitutional law, a baseball schedule, 2 photographs from a Sunday service where a young girl had played piano. Some had belly weight they would carry years. Some had heavier things, unmeasured. Many would write later with a sentence that sounded like a laugh. We weren't prisoners, we were almost guests. A story President Reagan favored included the German who told an American student that his happiest year was spent on a farm in Oklahoma and California, picking melons. I had to leave, he said, because the war ended. It is a sentimental story, true. It's also the kind that kept reappearing because it sounded like how memory feels when fear has ebbed and gratitude has had time to find sentences. The evidence is in the numbers and the records. The United States took in as many as 30,000 prisoners a month at the height, processed them at East Coast ports, and dispersed them in a lattice that reached into counties whose nameplates creak in the wind. The program generated revenue, millions of dollars from prisoner wages that offset costs, and saved more through labor at military posts. Less than 1% attempted escape, and most were caught. Officers had their own bungalows at senior facilities like Camp Clinton. Enlisted men had 40 square feet by treaty. Rations matched those of American troops. Thanksgiving turkeys were carved in mess halls under flags that had not been riddled. The International Red Cross came and went. There were abuses and exceptions and the daily indignities of captivity, and there were artifacts stacked now in local museums, wooden toys, oil paintings on scrap canvas, a chess set built from bread that had been dried hard and carved, then shellacked. A reminder that, even within the symbol, men found ways to make new symbols. How did it change them? Not all, not equally. Some returned to a broken Germany carrying, quite literally, parcels from American friends, coffee, stockings, chocolate, and stories they would tell carefully in towns where ruins and ration cards made any mention of American plenty feel like a boast. Years later, men who had scoffed at re-education classes found their sons in civics lectures and heard echoes they recognized. Others put down memory like a backpack and never picked it up again. But there was also this. A significant number returned with a working respect for obstinate procedures, jury service, local elections, newspapers that criticized officials without night knocks at the door, and a belief, unromantic, that democracy's most convincing argument was the ordinary competence that delivered hot coffee, full shelves, and fairness that did not depend on the mood of a particular man. It is not surprising that in the post-war years, some former POWs came back to America to live. Farmers in the Plains states, mechanics in the Midwest, doctors in coastal towns, revisiting the place where the bread had been white and the nights lit. Others helped build a democratic West Germany, their curiosity about a different civic life less easy to dismiss after what they had seen. All through the camps, the recurring symbol never left the table. The bread could stand for wastefulness to a European trained by ration and reserve to prize every gram. It could stand for vulgarity, too sweet, too soft. But again and again it stood for something else, a civic capacity, a system humming behind the scenes that believed enough in its own routines to treat enemies as men. The loaf might appear at a farm's long table, flanked by jars of preserves. It might be sliced in a mess hall by a corporal whose knife flashed in the light. It might be traded, stored, shared, shellacked into chess pieces. It might simply be eaten in 2 bites by a man who hadn't known for sure, until that second bite, that he was going to get a third. There is a way to speak about this that tries to make America the hero of every story. It isn't. There were prisons in the same nation whose restaurants barred black soldiers. There were letters begging for harsher measures and guards who did not deserve the responsibilities given them. There were men who used generosity as a lever to extract something like gratitude, and men who refused to be moved. There was propaganda and counter-propaganda, and the nothing special boredom that built into despair. Yet the larger pattern holds, the policy, binding and dull, scaled across the continent with a bureaucrat's attention to forms, fed and paid and taught and endured. It was not mercy, it was law. And for men trained to worship power that broke law, the discovery that law could be powerful enough to feed them was the beginning of a different faith. By early 1946, the trains ran east. Some rode first to Britain for labor under obligations, and then home to cities slogging through lean years. A few thousand never left American soil, buried in cemeteries whose grass is clipped on a schedule. Most wrote, at least once, to the families who had shared a meal or sent a parcel. Some sent back money they had earned picking pears or stacking hay. And in small American towns, in the plains and the South and the Southwest, people kept little keepsakes in drawers. A carved bird, a painted postcard, a photograph of thin young men standing behind wire, grinning as if the camera were a summer morning. In Nebraska, a minister kept candy wrappers a prisoner had given his kid. In Kansas, a concrete garage set true by a mason from Munster still squared the yard. In Alabama, the orchestra's baton waited in a museum case. A man's mind is not a nation, but sometimes in a camp built on the edge of a soybean field, a small nation is built in a mind. The flag over that nation is not stars or stripes. It is a loaf. America did not mean the bread itself. It meant the system that made the bread ordinary, even when ships were torpedoed and men were dying on beaches a world away. It meant a promise that the table would be set again tomorrow. If you want to know why a prisoner, asked years later about his time in the United States, might smile and say, "We weren't prisoners, we were guests," you have to imagine him at that table, hands still chapped from beet fields, watching a woman he has never met slice a loaf as if nothing in the world were difficult. There is a larger truth about freedom and abundance that this experience brushes. Freedom is not the right to eat white bread. It is the confidence that rules can protect both enemy and friend without collapsing. Abundance is not surplus. It is capacity that endures strain. A democracy that can maintain both under the worst pressure of a century is, in its ordinary way, profound. It defeats ideology not with sermons but with systems that work, with lights that stay on, with a guard who looks at a man who was his enemy last month and says, with no drama at all, "Lunch," and the knife rises and falls, and the crust cracks like a promise kept.